All right, guys, welcome back. We are back with our FORTINET NSE4 Journey. Okay, and so we're at the section to where we conquered an introduction to network address translation. We talked about how to, and we in a practical sense showed you guys how to configure right NAT within a firewall policy, right? So we're going to go ahead and jump into central NAT, right? And you know, spoiler alert, right? This is just basically configuring NAT outside of a firewall policy, right? And just make, right? We're still creating firewall policies, right? Because of course we still have that implicit deny. But what we're doing is we're making a separate policy just for NAT to react to traffic that passes through, right? And I know that's a lot right now, right? Again, big spoiler. So we're gonna take a few seconds, few minutes, in talking about theory. Then we're going to go ahead and hop into the lab so it can actually make sense. We're going to go ahead and do packet captures and what have you, right? This is a redo of yesterday because, of course, I had some lab mix-ups, but we go ahead and move. So let's go ahead and jump right in. All right. Any questions so far? Okay. All right. And of course, you guys know what the goal is, right? The goal of you guys learning central NAT, right? You guys learned about SNAT, you guys learned about DNAT, right? Source network address translation and destination network translation. You guys know the theoretical concept of how that works, right? Now you guys just need to see how central NAT has a technology, has its only for Fortigate, how it works. That's it, right? And how we can control, right, traffic flow, right, network address translation per se by IP address, protocol, and port translation. Okay, so let's go ahead and roll on through. So, how do we go ahead and enable central NAT, right? Well, just like I told you guys, the golden rule with FortiGate, right? There's certain things that you can configure in the GUI. There's certain things you can configure in the CLI, right? For the NSE4 that references the code train 7, right? 7.0, right? You can only enable central NAT in the CLI. Now, you can't do it in the GUI, but for the exam, okay, because this is straight out of the study guide, right? Is you can only do it in the CLI. So Donovan, Markevia, I want you guys to remember that. You can only enable central NAT via the CLI. I'm sorry, guys, that's my dog. He's apparently had a lot of dog candies, okay? So another thing about central NAT, right? Whenever you do configure it, you do have to remove your VIPs, aka your objects for destination NAT, right? Or DNAT, right? And you also have to remove your IP pools. You have to remove all your references for those things before you enable central NAT, right? And if not, you're going to go ahead and see that little error that pops up and says cannot enable central NAT with firewall policy, right? Using VIPs. Okay. All right. Now, once we go ahead and take care of that and we successfully, right, configure it, right, in the CLI, we go ahead and get back into the GUI, or we can just stay in the CLI. We'll get back in the GUI and we will see two things. If you look to the right side of the PowerPoint, you will see now we have two new options under policy and objects within the FortiGate GUI, which is now central SNAT, which is of course source NAT, and DNAT and virtual IPs, aka VIPs, that now we have access to, right? Central SNAT, right, is mandatory for next generation firewall policy base mode. And that's a simple sentence. I need to show you guys what that means. Okay. And you guys will see it once we begin configuring. Okay. All right. So, and again, we're going to jump into the lab in a little bit, but just want to give you guys some of these prerequisites, right? Right. Source NAT, right? Here's a couple of configuration changes. Whenever you are configuring, right, a central NAT, right? It's configured in the central SNAT option, right? You have to go ahead and in either A, when you configure that policy, configure the interfaces, you need to either say, hey, if traffic matches, right? Because we're doing if-then statements. If the criteria of the traffic matches everything that I defined, right? Then react to it, right? So I need to first go ahead and either define a IP pool or just say, hey, just use an outgoing interface to NAT my traffic coming from inside to out, or from one zone to another, right? And then I need to go ahead and just configure the rest of my source NAT policy. Okay. Just like a firewall policy or an ACL, right? Access control list, right? The central NAT policy list operates from top to bottom, meaning as soon as the FortiGates, right, sees traffic from the firewall policy that matches the central source NAT policy, it's going to say, hey, this is where I have to go ahead and react and perform an action on, right? Don, just like I was telling you yesterday, you had a question. If, right, because we had the firewall policy section, right, and now the different NAT sections, they operate all together. If there is no match for traffic, listen to what I'm saying, right? And I know this is going to be complex, and I'm going to show you guys this in the lab. If there is no match for traffic to be NATed, then the central source NAT or DNAT policy that you create will not react to that traffic to NAT, but the firewall policy will look for a different policy to react to that traffic, right? Okay. And no NAT would happen if there's no NAT policy that matches that traffic. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Don, because I know you had a question about that yesterday. Is it make sense? And you'll see more whenever we do the lag.
Oh, yes, it's clear. So if it's no NAT policy, it's just going to look for another policy to basically that it ties to, that it fits.
There you go. Okay. All right. So, and of course, at the bottom, you guys see the matching criteria, right? We talked about firewall policies in the previous section being if-then statements, right? If being that criteria, right? If all of this matches, then what is the action I'm taking? Okay. Little refresher. All right. Let's keep going. All right. And at this point, okay, I am not going to go ahead and bore you guys with theory. We are going to go ahead and just hop into the lab. All right. So let's talk about our topology, right? So, right, Mykedia Enterprises, right? This is her company, right? She owns, right? She owns several MSPs, right? And she puts a FortiGate for one of her customers, right? Connect to sites or what have you, right? They need to communicate. So she said, right, she's used to going ahead and just using a regular firewall policy, placing the NAT there, using the outgoing interface, right? But she hires Don, right? Hires Don, right? And Don brings up a new solution and says, hey, we can go ahead and use central NAT, right? What is that, right? And so this is what we're going to go ahead and configure, right? So we have our regular FortiGate, right? Let's go ahead and log in. Right? We have our FortiGate, right? It's running, right? Let's go ahead and confirm a few things first. It's running 7.0, right? What's needed for the exam, right? 7.0.0 build 0066, okay? Right? So her customer, right, is, they one branch, right, to the right, we're going to say, that's hanging off of port 3. That's one ISP. That's 45.25.1.0/24, right? And so, and at that site, right, the private IP address scheme is a 10.10.10.0/24. Okay? All right. So now on the other side, right, hanging off of port 2, how she connects the two sites, we have, we have a 128.168.1.0/24. That's her link for the other office, right? We're going to call that site 2, right? And behind that network in site 2 is a 10.10.20.0/24. Now, by default, right? private IP addresses cannot, right, be sent, traversed, or what have you, right, on the public network. There's needs to be some NAT, right, to go ahead and communicate that traffic based on the private network, right? So this is where NAT's coming in, right? And so we need to go ahead and make sure we connect each other, right? So I pre-configured, right? Pre-configured static routes, right? So it knows how to get to those networks, okay? And right, and it go, of course, traffic flow is if it want, if this FortiGate wants to reach 10.10.10.0, it knows where to send it. If it wants to reach 10.10.20.0, it knows where to send it, right? But right? But we want to go ahead and make sure we have NAT in place, right? So with regular NAT, right? With regular NAT, let's go ahead and have this in place, right? We have a regular northbound policy, right? And we're going to start with, site 2, right? And we're going to go ahead and just say, hey, let's go ahead and place NAT, outgoing interface, hit OK, right? And if I go ahead, I bring up PC4 and PC5, right? PC4, just to give you guys a reminder, is hanging off of site 2, right? If I go ahead and try to ping PC5, right, or site 3, we should have successful pings, right? Right? Well, we should. There we go. Right? Did its art, right? And if we do a packet capture, let's go ahead and go back to the FortiGate, right? And here's a refresher, and maybe you guys, it's your first time seeing it. If you go into a FortiGate, you can actually do a packet capture on the box rather than doing a span, on the actual device and creating a span for it. Okay, so we're gonna go ahead and capture that traffic, right? We don't need to do the packet capture for long. We're gonna take a look at this. Excellent. So it stopped. We're gonna go ahead and stop it, right? So we're not wasting resources on our FortiGate, right? And let's go ahead and check, right? Port 2. We're gonna see how that traffic looks first. Okay. So let's go ahead and download that. Let's go ahead and open up that packet capture. All right. So what I expect to see is traffic with the original source, the source not being translated yet because it didn't leave the FortiGate, is a 10.10.20.50 going to a 10.10.20.50, right? And so this is what we see, right? We see the request and reply because we're capturing on the inside interface, right? Because we configured NAT with the firewall policy. If we go to the other side, right, the egress interface, right, that's leaving and going to its destination, right, we go ahead and do that. What I expect is the source to be different, right, and to be that outside interface, right, and that's exactly it, right. We see the NAT right there, 45.25.1.1, right, to .50. We see that. That's working, right. So in a sense, right, to keep things simple, NAT is working the same, right? It's working absolutely the same, right? So there's no change whenever I say the word central NAT. There's no change to the actual theory of how NAT works. There is a change to the configuration and how it works as a whole in operation inside the FortiGate, but not so much as a theory, okay? So let's go ahead and stop these pings. Right, we're gonna go ahead and stop these pings, right? We're gonna go ahead and reset this. Now, let's go ahead and enable this firewall to do central NAT, right? I told you guys we can go ahead and do it in the CLI, right? But I wanted to go ahead and first give you guys a golden nugget just for you guys day to day, right? You can enable central source NAT right here. You can go ahead and enable it right here. It's perfectly fine, right? But for purposes as it relates to the exam, we're going to go ahead and do it in the CLI, okay? So first, we're going to go ahead and do the config system, right? And it's going to be the settings because we're making changes to the actual system. And we're going to do set a central NAT, and we're going to go ahead and enable it. Okay. Once we hit either end or next, it's going to go ahead and save that configuration to the FortiGate. Right. We're going to go ahead and refresh. And so now we look at it. If you scroll down, you see this is up, right? And it's toggled to green, meaning it's enabled. But the other changes that we saw in the PowerPoint, we see two more things, right? We see a central source NAT, section, and we see a DNAT, destination NAT, and virtual IP section. Okay. The first change, right? And this is where, of course, the lab got tricky. And of course, I actually forgot the configuration steps, right? Because it's an order operation. The first thing you notice is this. Don, there's a little section right here, right? If you can, if you see that, I'm going to read it out to you guys. Typically where we configure NAT, it is no longer there. On the firewall policy section, it says central NAT is enabled, so NAT settings from matching central source NAT policies will be applied. Okay? So, going back to the PowerPoint, central source NAT is mandatory for next generation firewall policy base mode. Why? Well, your traffic can't pass. Your traffic can't pass it. It won't know what to do if it doesn't have central source NAT. That's mandatory for the technology of NAT in general, right? In firewall operation. Okay? Right? So, this is what you're saying whenever you say, I want to go ahead and enable central NAT. Now, if you have central NAT disabled, you can decide if you want to go ahead and NAT your traffic or not. Once you enable central NAT, you're now saying all your traffic is going to be NATed. So now you have a NAT box in a sense. Does that make sense, Don?
Yes, it does.
Okay. All right. So now that we did that, right, we need a policy, right? So, right, firewall policy, right? We have an if-then statement there. We have our northbound, right, incoming, outgoing, source, destination, schedule, service. We have all that there. So this is our whole if. Then it does an action, right? Except, right? And of course, typically that action will tell it to do more things, right? Firewall network option, which of course is NAT. Do some things on the UTM side, right? Look at the packet and reference, right? Antivirus and what have you. But we're just focused on NAT for now, right? And so how would this traffic get NATed? Well, the firewall will say, hey, we have our firewall policy here, right? But I'm going to go ahead and reference, right, either your central source NAT policy table or your destination NAT policy table. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and create central NAT, right? We're going to go ahead and say what our incoming interface is. This, since it's port 2, outgoing interface is going to be port 3. Okay, we can add multiple interfaces like you guys see, right? Because we're creating the criteria to go ahead and match it, right? We're going to go ahead and do source address. We're going to do all. Destination address, we're going to do all, right? We're going to go ahead and say, hey, we're enabling that, and we're using an outgoing interface. Enable this policy. We're going to hit OK. All right. So what I expect, right? Let's go ahead and start packet captures. Go ahead and restart them. Let's go ahead and start those pings. Go ahead and do that. Right. So what I expect, right, once we go ahead and take a look at packets, right, we can go ahead and stop it for now. Right. So then go ahead and download it. Go ahead and open up this PCAP, right? We see that traffic, right? Inside the inside interface, right? Port 2. We see 10.10.20.50, right? But here's where we're going to see if central source NAT is working, is if we look at the outside interface, okay? So we go ahead and do a download of that, okay? And Don, what do we see? Do we see that outside interface of the FortiGate?
Yeah, we see the 45.25.
There we go. There we go. So all good. Oh, all good to go, right? And that's central source NAT, right? That's typically what it is, right? From a theoretical standpoint, right? You can configure destination NAT as well, but you guys have seen what source NAT and destination NAT is. Whenever you configure and you tell your box to be, hey, now you're officially, one of your roles is to be a NAT box, right? Your firewall policies is in one section, but your firewall policies is, of course, you see the section that says custom. It is now going to reference either a central source NAT policy, or B, a destination NAT policy. Okay? All right. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Any questions?
And configuring a destination NAT policy is the same.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Much similar. And so you're still going to create your VIPs, right? And I don't want to dive into it because I know we're coming up on time. You're still going to create your VIPs. It's not so much going to have a policy table, but what you're going to do, right? Because how traffic works, right? It's inside out everywhere, right? And depending on where your traffic is coming from, right, is how you define inside out, right? So destination NAT, right? Your inside may be the WAN, right? And your outside may be the your LAN, right? For DNAT as far as traffic flow. Okay. So you would create your VIP for reference, your VIP objects, and then you're going to go ahead and go into your central source NAT policy and say, hey, my outside interface, my incoming is going to be my outside, right? And the outgoing is going to be this. And then your source, right, is going to be all. And then you would put your DNAT or your VIP right there. Right?
Okay.
Okay.
Yep.
And then you have to still go into your firewall policy and say southbound traffic, right? But then the firewall policy is going to say, I have this here, but depending on my central source NAT policy list, I need to go ahead and reference that and see if there's anything that matches that. That makes sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay. All right, guys. Well, I will go ahead and end it here. Hopefully, now central NAT makes sense, right? I'm just going to go ahead and ask 2 questions. Don, you know how I do, right? Just as a review. Hopefully, you guys understand source NAT, right? So, I'm going to ask 2 questions, right? First question is you either have, 1 or 2 answers. So here's the first question. Which statement is true? Is it A, central NAT is not enabled by default? Or is it B, both central NAT and firewall policy NAT can be enabled together?
A.
All right, there we go. Central NAT is not enabled by default. You saw us having to go ahead and go into CLI. Question 2, what happens if there is no central source NAT policy or no central source NAT policy configured? Basically the same thing. Is it A, the egress interface IP will be used, or B, NAT will not be applied to the firewall session?
B.
There we go. There we go. And that's it, guys. All right. Well, I'll go ahead and end this session. Again, it's a real quick session. In that next session, we're going to go ahead and talk about session helpers, and hopefully we can go ahead and get through session helpers and talk about sessions. And come Saturday, we can go ahead and finish out with best practices and troubleshooting when it comes to NAT. All right.
All right. Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
All right, guys. You have a great day.